Good morning and welcome. I'm Mary Poling. I'm the coordinator of interactive communications with the University of Arkansas System Division of Ag Cooperative Extension, and I'm your guest host today for today's Financial Security for All Community of Practice. I'm substituting for Dr. Laura Hendricks, who had to be away today. The title of our session today is Insights from 5 Financial Education Policy Convenings. In January and February of 2021, the National Endowment for Financial Education, known as NEFE, partnered with the Council for Economic Education, also known as CEE, to host 5 convenings focused on specific challenges in the K-12 financial education space. Today's webinar will highlight major themes from these conversations and discuss possible next steps for different stakeholders in the financial ecosystem that everyone has the knowledge, confidence, and opportunity to live their best financial life. So our presenter today is Chris Shannon, Vice President, External Affairs for the National Endowment for Financial Education. Chris's role includes overseeing the communications, marketing, and NEFE strategic partnership functions. Her work with NEFE started well before she was formally brought on as staff. She's been helping hundreds of educators, nonprofit staff, and private sector volunteers effectively leverage NEFE's materials to benefit young adults. In addition, she helped design financial education train-the-trainer models. Chris's experience includes 12 years working as a classroom instructor in grades K through 16, working in a variety of public education settings, including high school, community college, and a state university. She has also worked at various levels in the young adult workforce development space, including secondary to post-secondary career and technical education programming and collaboration. So please join me in welcoming Chris Shannon. Chris?
Hi, thank you so much, Mary, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And I am so grateful to be here with all of you today. Laura and I have been talking about this webinar for well over a year. And with the pandemic, we had to pivot the initiative that was going to inform this conversation several times. So I am so grateful because I feel like I'm now on the other end of a very long and trying journey, as I'm sure that's the case for all of you in higher ed. So first, I just want to tell you a little bit about the initiative I referenced. So we decided, almost exactly 2 years ago, to partner with the Council for Economic Education to host 5 policy convenings. And what's interesting about that is they were initially going to be lunches where there would be a presentation. The Council for Economic Education, if you're not familiar, they do a biannual survey of the states where they talk about the status of financial education legislation and what the legislation includes in various states. So if you've never seen that report, I recommend going to their website, councilforeconed.org, I think is their web address. And a lot of times they will link that information to whatever research may be relevant. So for example, I believe in the last version, they linked to Dr. Carly Urban's research around the downstream effects in higher education for secondary financial education mandates. So they do kind of tie those things together. So initially, these were just going to be in-person lunches with state policymakers to show them the survey of the states and to answer any questions they may have about legislation, kind of what's effective, what other states have done. And then when we had to pivot to virtual, we completely shifted our strategy. So instead of presenting to policymakers, we decided to engage them in conversations, but to break out of the echo chambers that tend to happen in our sector, where like K through 12 people talk only with K through 12 people in this space, and banks and financial institutions only talk to banks and financial institutions in this space, and broaden the conversation to a wider array of stakeholders who are working as intermediaries to promote or implement financial education so that they could learn more from each other and ask questions of each other to create more of a peer-to-peer network. But the focus for these conversations came from over 100 interviews that CEE and NEFE conducted to ask, where are the pain points on the ground, and if we were going to meet you where you are in terms of legislation, what would the next step look like for your state and why? Just to really better understand it, rather than just beating kind of a global drumbeat of more mandates. Could we be more intentional, thoughtful, and supportive for the states as they try and navigate these tricky waters, along with so many other tricky waters that they're navigating? So one of the reasons why we made the pivot, a pandemic, of course, offered us an opportunity to rethink our strategy, but it was also because we last year made the decision to sunset all of our direct-to-consumer programming and resources. And I hope that's not news to you. For those of you who are familiar with NEFE and NEFE's work, hopefully you have heard this announcement. We made the announcement last fall. I believe we shared that information during the pre-symposium for AFCPE for the co-op extension folks last fall. So hopefully this isn't new information. If it is, I'll give you a second to recover, because the first question we usually get asked is, and what's happening to cash course? And if it's not cash course, then it's what's happening with the high school program. So we can have that conversation. I wanted to make sure that I covered the webinars first. But with that new strategic direction, we were moving away from individual interventions based on a lot of field asset mapping that we did, interviews, market research, to really understand, we've been in this space for a long time now. Are we still bringing value add? And that was, we learned a lot about new players in this space and disruptors in this space, and trying to figure out, what are our assets? What do we think are our assets? What does everybody else think our assets are? And that really helped to inform, we were one of the top providers of quality education content in the financial education space for so long. I'm not sure that we can 100% say that anymore because of some of the new players in the space, which, of all the problems to have, is an excellent problem. But it told us that maybe we could better use our resources and build off of our legacy, maybe in a different way. So we are moving more toward systems change. And so these policy convenings was kind of a proof of concept in that direction. Just so you get a sense of what we were trying to do. And it was really primarily wanting to, if states are going to enact legislation, that they do it with an intentionality, that they understand what goes into effective financial education programming, and to make sure that that initiative that they do at the state level is truly supported. And one of the themes that surfaced over the course of all of the events is not just supported, but funded. So that's something that will be coming out of our discussion summaries. But we also wanted an opportunity to ask the question, if there were any questions that, if they were answered, would further your work, what are those questions? What are those questions, and can we play a role in helping to answer those questions? So trying to surface a possible research agenda, not just for us, but for anyone in the field who may be interested in this space, or in education, or consumer or economic ed. So trying to surface that on behalf of the field, and then also just to give folks across sectors an opportunity to network with one another. In 2014, the Workforce Development System reauthorized their federal legislation. And when they did, they included financial education. And having worked in that sector for a long time, I got the sense that there was this, well, we're not aware of anyone else doing this, so we must invent this wheel, and we're going to start by writing a curriculum. And that seems to be the answer to so many people who may not have encountered financial education. No one else did this for me, so I'm going to do it for others, and I'm going to create an app or create a program. I think that happens quite a bit. If any of you are familiar with those kinds of initiatives, I'd love for you to drop it in the chat just to learn more about where that might work. But the connections were really great. And like the Federal Student Aid Office made several connections that are going to help them think through what equitable access to post-secondary education training might look like from a financial education perspective, particularly for more rural populations. So it really broadened the conversation around common themes, but broaden it across different partners. All right, so did we succeed? So those are our 3 goals, and just here's some, bragging rights, some stats. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to tell you some of the stats that would be more pertinent to you and to your field. We had 44 states who actually ended up being represented over the course of the 5 events. Who was there? We had 22 higher education institutions attend from 19 states, and 4 of those were extension offices. We heard a lot across all of the events around community and being community centric in financial education, not in both form and practice and with the content. So with the content, thinking about the specific assets that the community has and the resources available, and adjusting content for those specific circumstances or perhaps values. There are communities that may have values that differ from what we call the mainstream. It's what folks in some of the more rural geographies will call kind of the urban-centric, popular sorts of points, content, things of that nature. So, but what is outside of the mainstream in terms of values? I had a fabulous conversation with a gentleman from the Pueblo Nation. And one of the questions that I've grown very fond of is, what content do you find in traditional financial education materials that is at odds or create tensions within your community? And I've gotten some really fascinating responses to that. But he said all of it. And I took a stop and I'm thinking, well, that's kind of a conversation killer right there. But I asked him, I said, can you elaborate? What do you mean? And he said, our community, the center value is the stability and mobility and the ability to thrive for the community itself. And financial education traditionally is so individually focused. It's focused on self-reliance. It's focused on, preparing yourself for future shocks, preparing yourself for retirement, and then eventually that kind of extends to your family. And savings in his community was sometimes seen as selfish because you are hoarding a resource that might better benefit the community at that time. And that was fascinating to me. That was very eye-opening. And I've had, several conversations along those lines saying, so do you not teach saving in, Native communities? And the response was, no, that's not it at all. They do, but they reframe it in a way that aligns with Native values or the values within their specific communities. So that's an example in terms of the forming content. They also talked in terms of supporting financial education in diverse communities. The theme of engaging with community leaders cropped up all the time. And one of the things that's really interesting to me about this in general was this was shocking headline news to me, but for at least 75% of the people who participated, who were on the ground at the state level or in the community level, intermediaries or extension folks or financial educators, they knew all this stuff already. It's like the intermediaries within the communities are making these on the ground adjustments in real time. The problem is there isn't a feedback loop to share that back up to those of us at the national level who are creating content that's being used in the classroom, and how can we learn from that? So that is absolutely something I would love to discuss with the group on the call today. I'd love to hear about the adjustments that you make to the content, or to what are financial goals, or how you teach certain concepts so that they are more inclusive and really resonate within the communities that you serve. Because I know you do it all the time. It's new to us. Obviously, making sure that state policymakers know what works. And one of the things that we learned over the convenings is that we know the research really well, but we're not always doing a good job of elevating that research. So people ask questions, and I'll show you, we'll talk a little more deeply about that later, but they would ask questions. We're like, we already know the answer to that question. The research was published 3 years ago. Where have you been? And of course, they don't eat, breathe, and sleep this stuff the way we do. So it's on us to make sure that we are amplifying that research so that we're not asking the same questions that were being asked 7, 8, 10 years ago post-recession, but that we're growing our learning and building off of it, and that we're weaving that into policy and practice. A theme that came up from the participants was just centralizing, and I say efforts, it could mean a state level initiative. Sometimes there are states that have sometimes not intentionally, but maybe competing or different initiatives going on at the same time, and maybe one's by a nonprofit entity that's statewide, another one may be from the treasurer's office, career and tech ed may have their own, rather than really aligning these, and maybe they're trying to move the same needle, but from a different facet of the problem, or with a different population or a different intervention. So centralizing those efforts and centralizing resources, that came up loud and clear from practitioners in communities and in classrooms. It's just, where do we go to find something that is vetted, and who can help with that? And that's something that we're thinking about as well. How you word it and what you measure matters. And we've learned that, especially in regards when we think about, once again, being more inclusive in what we mean by financial education, what financial goals and financial stability looks like from person to person and family to family and community to community. And those are other stories that we're collecting, like the question I asked you in terms of how are you pivoting? How are you reframing? One of my favorites is savings is a bill that you pay your grandchildren. So if savings is not aligned with the values of an individual, family, or community, how can you reframe it in a way that still encourages them to leverage that financial stability, but not as an individual, but still in support of a community, or support of whatever that person values and what is normed for their culture. And the last thing is that legislation, if you mandate it, it happens. Now, it doesn't guarantee quality across the state, especially when you have uneven resources from school to school and district to district. But it at least ensures that it is happening at some level within the state. It would be more likely to happen if there's some level of accountability. And sometimes that's not always baked into the legislation. And then funding as an equity question came up repeatedly when you have districts with different levels of resources, and not just financing, but rural districts really struggle to find teachers, much less content experts in specific topics that maybe would be taught as an elective, and having enough students to finance that person full time. It's just really challenging for them. So extra funding helps them to explore, sharing, or maybe a virtual option, or partnering with a local higher education institution, you know, for maybe dual enrollment or whatever that might look like, to think about other ways that they can still achieve the mandate, still provide quality financial education, despite the assets and resource deficits that they may experience in their communities. We wanted to share the research questions that were raised that were of interest to us. I'm not going to read them to you because you are smart people capable of reading. But like I said before, what really surprises were the questions that were asked that we were like, we thought everybody kind of knew this at this point. So the questions that were asked that we knew that, you know, do we know that state level or do we know what the state level outcomes are for states with mandates? So someone should be tracking that. And we're like, and someone is. So, you know, Carly Urban's been doing that. Next Gen Personal Finance has been doing a pretty good job of fueling that kind of research. And we are also funding research that doesn't necessarily get at the immediate outcomes, but a lot of the downstream effects. And of course, we funded some of Dr. Carly Urban's research. My colleagues on the call would be rolling their eyes if I did not mention that. Another one is, do we have a strong enough or compelling enough business case for financial and economic education? And thanks in large part to the research that's out there, the answer is really a resounding yes. It's just, how do we better communicate the business case, particularly in a way that will resonate with state policymakers and state policy influencers. And finally, can we show that students who come from states with mandated financial education programs fare better than those that don't? And once again, it was pointed right back to Dr. Urban's research and the work that she has done. And then, so this is kind of where I land. This is my final slide, just so you know. But there are other questions that were raised that we think deserve really good consideration, especially at the state level, but are not necessarily research questions, but questions that if we were able, you know, collectively to answer, could help move the field forward. And one that I'd really like to focus on, because it's a conversation that started with the policy convenings, and it's been fascinating for me, and something that I love to talk to practitioners about is the concept of signals or markers of financial well-being. You know, if we were going to describe someone that we feel stereotypically is, you know, has really sound financial stability or financial health, what does that look like? And just a personal anecdote. So when I was starting in financial education, a lot of these markers resonated with me. So they were markers that I continued to perpetuate. So thinking about like simply having a savings account, having a formal relationship with a financial institution, rather than using check cashing or payday lending. Having emergency savings so that you can help smooth out the kind of peaks and valleys of income and expenses, and navigate financial shocks more effectively and proactively. You know, planning for your future, the time value of money, make sure that if your employer's providing retirement, that you're putting, you know, that you're taking advantage of that. Don't leave free money on the table. And then protecting your assets and making sure that you're, you know, ensuring things that are of value, and making sure that you are leaving behind a legacy of financial stability for your family or your loved ones. And it struck me, after 10 years of doing this, it struck me, I'm selling a checking account, a savings account, insurance, and like retirement accounts. And that doesn't even get into investing. I'm like, am I an educator or am I working for a bank? And I had a real identity crisis because I realized that those markers made sense for me. But for a whole host of reasons based on my culture, my value, my family, how I was raised, and aren't necessarily reflective of the financial goals that other people might have. So talking about financial signals, and are any of them like gender normed, for example, or geography normed? Are any of them class normed? And just having a conversation around that. We're not defining anything definitively, but it's just a point of surfacing differences rather than assuming my financial goals are yours. And once again, I feel like I'm probably preaching to the choir, as I know that so many of you are working in the communities, and you understand this, you realize this, but once again, there are no feedback loops coming back to national entities like NEFE. So that question has really resonated with me, and it's spun me off in kind of a new direction of inquiry. But I just wanted to share that and share some of these other questions.
Chris, we want to say thank you. And on behalf of Dr. Laura Hendricks, thank you for sharing the insights from the convenings and for being so open with us today.
Thank you all. It's been my pleasure.